The federal NDP have wrapped their caucus retreat in Montreal, laying out a plan for the months ahead. One of their priorities, distancing themselves from the federal Liberal government's carbon tax.
We disagree with the approach of Justin Trudeau, who's tried to pit workers against each other. He set up a scenario where in certain regions, based on electoral politics, he's giving advantages to the Atlantic provinces over other parts of the country. We disagree with that. I've came out very strongly opposed to that approach. We want to see an approach to fighting the climate crisis where it doesn't put the burden on the backs of working people.
The Conservatives have been calling, of course, for an election over the carbon tax, but if an election were held today, it seems a lot of Canadians aren't sure which party best represents them. According to new data from Angus Reid, half of Canadians feel no federal political party really represents their views, and 1/3 of voters describes themselves as political orphans who find all the parties are too extreme. So what does that sense of alienation tell us about the dynamic of the next election, whenever it may be? We're going to talk about that and other things with the Power Panel. Emily Nicola is a columnist for Le Devoir. James Moore is a former federal Conservative cabinet minister. And here with me in the studio, Cameron Ahmad is a former head of communications for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist. Happy Thursday, gang. It's good to see you all. Hello. Okay, we've got one more thing to add to that mix. It just happened right before the show started. It's British Columbia Premier and NDP leader David Eby who's talking about the carbon tax, and he expressed a willingness to get rid of it. Have a listen to this.
The political consensus that we had in British Columbia has been badly damaged by the approach of the federal government to this issue. Our commitment is that if the federal government decides to remove the legal backstop requiring us to have a consumer carbon tax in British Columbia, we will end the consumer carbon tax in British Columbia.
Okay, some interesting news there from David Eby. Jordan, what do you make of this as the new Democrat in the room? NDP Premier in the province where carbon pricing really started. I mean, I remember when they were negotiating the big framework, Christy Clark's concern was everyone else wouldn't keep pace with British Columbia, and here you have this development today. What do you make of it?
That's right. It's a bit of back to the future because, of course, originally there were concerns that came from the NDP about the imposition of a carbon tax. So, look, I think that we're in election season. I think that what Premier Eby said about this policy being so dramatically unpopular among Canadians because of how the federal Liberals handled it is true. And, you know, there's a lot of ways to get to the emissions reductions that Canada needs. Carbon tax is one of those tools. There are other options for pricing on the table. And so I think that given the unpopularity of the policy, it's not surprising to see some other ideas come forward around that.
Hey, long time no see.
That's a bit what you're seeing there today.
Oh, sorry. It's just hearing something in my ear. I don't know what that was. Something was open. Go ahead, Jordan. Keep finishing.
Yeah, so I think what Singh is saying here is that after the breakup of the confidence and supply agreement, he's taking an opportunity to gain even more distance from the Liberals. Right. They're not going to carry water for this unpopular policy. And I think politically that's probably a pretty smart move for him, especially with the by-election coming up in Winnipeg on Monday.
Cameron, how do you see this? I mean, they say earlier this year when Mark Ramsey at the Toronto Star wrote about Jagmeet Singh seemingly distancing himself from this, the NDP got very defensive and said no, they weren't. Yet here they are, and yes, they have. And he's not saying how he's going to vote on confidence agreements, and it seems like this is tailor-made for a scenario where Pierre Poilievre brings in a confidence vote based around getting rid of the carbon tax for consumers.
Yeah, I think he's put a lot of pressure on himself. And as we talked about last week, there's some incoherence in the messaging in dropping the agreement with the Liberals. I mean, there's a way they could have done this that focused a little bit more positively on the things they accomplished without trying to make it such a negative thing. I think today's news I find quite disappointing and a bit demoralizing.
The David Eby part or the Jagmeet Singh part?
Both of them.
You have to be more specific.
I think specifically
surround sound.
But specifically for the leader of the NDP, I mean, this is obviously a really important part of Canada's plan to meet its targets and to actually do something meaningful about climate change. And I don't see how anyone can take this other than abandoning principle. I mean, it's incoherent to say you're going to stop supporting this policy that you've supported for a long time without putting anything else forward that's credible. And I think there's not really an excuse for a progressive party in this day and age to not have something serious to say about climate change. They're certainly entitled to come up with something a little bit later and put something forward closer to an election. But at this stage, climate change is ravaging the country every summer, and I don't see how he can come across with looking credible with this announcement today.
Yeah, James, Jagmeet Singh says they're working on a plan or have the concepts of a plan, to borrow a phrase that's going around this week, but there was no clear alternative laid out there. And then we saw what David Eby had to say. I mean, the consensus that existed with the Vancouver Declaration on doing this is obliterated. It just seems this is an inevitable thing that's going to go away.
How the ground has shifted. I mean, I remember, I'm old enough to remember just a couple of years ago when I was on this show and other shows, and people were saying that conservatives cannot win unless they're serious about climate change. And the only way you can show that you're serious about climate change is if you're in favor of a price on carbon. Now, here we are. And now apparently the only way an NDP government can get reelected in British Columbia is if they show that they're open to getting rid of a carbon tax. So the ground has shifted quite dramatically. With regard to Jagmeet Singh, you know, he had the confidence and supply agreement, and he had the confidence and supply agreement right as interest rates and inflation were reaching their apex moment. That would have been the time to say, hey, look, we need to shift the confidence and supply agreement because the cost of consumers and the impact that this is having on them is something that's not sustainable. And in this unique and rare window, we need to sort of pare down the cost of living for everyday Canadians and help them with their cost of living. Now, interest rates are coming down. Inflation has now gone down. The impact of the carbon tax on everyday consumers is actually less now than it was 12, 24 months ago. And now Jagmeet Singh comes forward and says, we need to really do something about the cost of living. And like, does this guy ever miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity? Like his political antenna is bent beyond bent.
But James, just they're not abandoning a price on carbon entirely because they still support industrial carbon pricing and the offset mechanisms, and so does David Eby, as I understand it, because he went on to say that, and that is an issue where we still don't have clarity. For example, from Pierre Poilievre, right? Like, yes, axe the tax, but what about industrial pricing? Because there's trade implications and border tariffs that come from this. That's still an issue the Conservatives could provide some clarity on.
It is, and with regard to the situation in British Columbia, I mean, for David Eby to do this now, just as you saw in that video clip, the signs are being printed and the campaign is about to kick off here in British Columbia. He's opened the barn door now for John Rustad to say, hey, look, David Eby was silent on the carbon tax for years. They opposed it when but Gordon Campbell brought it in when Carol Taylor was the finance minister in British Columbia. They were silent when Christy Clark was premier. They did nothing when they were in government. And now that Pierre Poilievre has a 20-point lead in the province of British Columbia, now they're going to turn around and say, well, we're open to working with Pierre Poilievre to get rid of it. This I mean, the carbon taxes have been a relatively quiet issue in British Columbia because there has been a political consensus. There's sort of a collapse of a media market environment here where people can drive a message. But now that David Eby has opened the door, John Rustad can grab it with both hands and say, don't trust that guy. He stayed silent when it was brought in. He did nothing when he was in government. And now he says, if you want a premier who's going to work with Pierre Poilievre and lower the cost of living, you know I'm your guy because we're both conservatives. So I think this is a strategic, huge error for David Eby.
Emily, how do you see it? I know it's cap and trade in Quebec. It is not a consumer carbon price, so it's the debate just isn't at play there, even though that's where Jagmeet Singh formalized this news. What's your reaction to what we saw today?
It's a great point to make in the sense that there very much needs to be a clear difference made for everyone between discussing the carbon tax and discussing price on carbon. There's many ways that we can price the carbon, and that's not necessarily the carbon tax, and the Quebec model is an alternative to that. However, I remember just a couple years ago, and even every month, we used to be very serious about meeting this 2025 deadline of not having climate tip over 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2025. 2025 is in 3 months, and I'm aghast that we're having this conversation in Canada where the Progressive Party is saying we don't want the carbon tax, but we'll figure out what our plan will be. Is not where we should be at this time of year in this day and age. And I think there's a division in Canada for people who actually care about the climate somewhat. The Green Party is completely absent of this conversation, which is amazing. Once again, we're having a national debate about carbon tax. We have a Green Party in Canada. They're nowhere to be seen. The NTB knows what they don't want. It's unclear as to this point what they do want. The Liberals are very clear on what they do want, but there is a political price to pay for that. And the Conservatives know that they don't want it because they don't want the issue as well, or they don't want to deal with the issue either. And so that's where we are. The planet is still burning.
Yes, it is. And in a lot of the places where the opposition to carbon pricing is the strongest, it's arguably burning the most. But, you know, Jordan, we've got this pendulum effect on this now that everyone's all in on carbon pricing with a rebate. People said, oh, if you put a tax on it, you're going to punish the poor. Well, there's a rebate that helps them. Oh, it's just wealth redistribution. And you have at the other side, don't put any price on it. Tie it back to that polling we talked about from Angus Reid, that everyone thinks things are too, not everyone, a lot of people think things are too extreme. There's no sort of thing in the middle. It's just these big swings back and forth. And here's happened on this important policy to deal with an existential issue.
I think when I read that polling, what I see is just a general distaste for politics. I think that really
Fair.
A lot of that is about saying that people feel that bad things are bad and the rhetoric is bad and the negativity is bad. And that does make people want to tune out of the political space. And so it's not too surprising to me that a high number of Canadians would feel maybe unhappy with some of the options in front of them. I think when it comes to this debate, though, it's important to remember there's a lot of ways to get from point A to point B on emissions reductions. And if we look at our southern neighbor, massive investments that Joe Biden put in, those don't include a price on carbon at all. As to what the NDP is going to put forward, I think that we can deduce fairly clearly that it's going to be something involving an industrial carbon price. And that's actually the thing that's going to be driving the largest amount of emissions reductions over the next 5 years. And the party that really hasn't answered any questions related to their climate plan so far, that's the Conservatives.
There are a lot of ways to reduce emissions, but we're deep into the time frame on which as a country we're supposed to be doing it. And this was the centerpiece of the plan, Cameron. I mean, you were there when it was all signed on. And yes, I know the United States does not have a national price on carbon, but California's got one. A lot of New England states have them. Like a good chunk of the U.S. economy has them. And Canada can't match what the U.S. is doing on the green transition. So where does this leave the country, you know, with a front-runner party, with an unclear policy, and definitely no consumer price on carbon? The New Democrats doing this and the Liberals really struggling.
Well, a front-runner party that also kind of has made it clear that they don't take this issue seriously. They don't think it's worth putting front and center because reading the political tea leaves doesn't seem like it's a winner for them. I think another important thing to try and dissect as we think about this issue is there's been a significant amount of dishonesty when talking about the price on carbon. I mean, under multiple, through multiple elections, it's been mischaracterized. A lot of the rhetoric around it is untrue. We can certainly talk about the responsibility that the Liberals and the government has in communicating it better, going back several years, of course. But I think what, unfortunately, Jagmeet Singh has done has endorsed the dishonest characterization of it that the Conservatives have led for years and tied himself in a way to the Conservatives because he has no climate plan. He doesn't support the centerpiece plan that the government has been and that they've been supporting for years and has nothing further to say on the issue. So if there is any opportunity for the Liberals here, it's to continue to fight this fight and be the only party that is tied to this policy that is a really important one. Yes, Jordan, you're entirely right. There are many things that we can do as a country to try and meet our targets, but this is truly one of the best. I mean, we don't like to hear from experts these days, sadly, but experts all say that this is one of the best things that we can do just from a policy perspective.
Yeah, and look, and there are a bunch of things that are part of the climate plan. This just becomes the flashpoint one. Yeah. So James, on this, we know what the Conservatives aren't going to do. We don't know what they're going to do. We ask them, they don't answer. They say, wait for the election. They're going to try to force an election at the earliest possible moment, as they keep saying. I mean, if you want to have an election, not an argument, over carbon taxing and climate policy, shouldn't you be able to say to Canadians what your alternative is before you bring down the House of Commons?
Yeah, and I'm sure that they will, and they understand the expectation that's out there. But again, the shifting ground that's happened here is quite dramatic. This idea that the Liberals have a position of moral righteousness on carbon pricing and the importance of climate change, they abandoned their own policy when they created the carve-out for Atlantic Canada that was chastised by Catherine McKenna, the first Environment Minister of Justin Trudeau, and probably the most serious minister that they had on this file. And then the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, never made it part of the supply and confidence motion himself. He never made it a reason why he's breaking away from the agreement. And the NDP in British Columbia, one of two provincial NDP governments in the country, is now prepared to walk away from the policy themselves. So the idea that if you don't believe in carbon pricing and carbon taxes, that you're not serious about climate change is an unserious argument that isn't believed by those who advanced the argument just a few months ago.
Right. Well, I have to point out, because I am an Atlantic Canadian, I know it's about the politics of Atlantic Canada, but it is a national carve-out on home heating oil, and more people outside of Atlantic Canada benefit for it.
It's just,
I want to go home, so I have to make that correction every time.
I agree with what you're saying, James. It's just that it's unserious if you don't propose anything of your own. And
anything at all. It doesn't have to be this, but there needs to be something.
Climate change is an issue that we just started talking about a year ago. Like, we're deep into this, and as Emily pointed out, the planet is burning, Canada is burning. I think it's irresponsible if you can't put anything, even a concept forward of what you're going to do instead.
Conversally, I don't.
Okay, James first, and I got to get Emily. Go ahead, James. Go ahead.
Jordan, go ahead.
Okay.
I was going to say, conversely.
I was going to say, it's not fair to say they haven't put forward proposals. Sorry, there were a series of a lot of very serious and substantive proposals that were in the Conservative platform in 2021. And many of them were lauded and well regarded. But again, Liberals are the Liberal Party, with respect, are in no position to be morally self-righteous about climate policy. They have zigzagged away from their own policy time and again. And again, they're in no position to preach to others. The Conservatives, yes, to your point, do need to have something significant and substantive to say. And I think that they understand that that is the expectation.
Okay, Jordan, quickly, and I got to give Emily last word, and I got to take a break.
Yeah, well, James stole my point about the Liberals being the ones opening the door to political weakening of this policy. But look, here's the thing. The NDP ran 2 elections about a decade ago proposing a strong cap-and-trade alternative. There are other ways to get there. The other thing here is that I think it's unrealistic to expect the NDP to carry water on a policy that the Liberals have failed to defend to the public. That's not on them. That's on this government, and that's something they haven't answered for.
No, but asking for the plan from the alternatives, Emily, I don't think is an inappropriate thing to request, especially when Jagmeet Singh himself has said an election could happen any day now. Poilievre wants to fight the election on this very issue. So last word to you.
We need a plan from the NDP yesterday on climate change. We need a plan for the Conservatives on climate change. We need the Green Party to exist in this conversation. We need the Bloc Québécois to explain to the rest of Canada what cap and trade actually is. And we need for people to get their ducks in a row. To go back to the conversation about people not feeling they identify with the political options that are in front of them, it's very difficult for people to not identify with policies when the policies are actually not very clear. I think it's more a matter of tone and how politicians are talking to one another that makes people tune out and not necessarily identify. But this issue of climate change is a really good example of how if people don't identify with the political parties, it's not about the policies because the policies are not actually out there that much.